November 11th, 1916. The Western Front, somewhere between the Somme and the Anchor rivers. The morning fog hung low over the scarred landscape, a ghostly veil masking the true horrors hidden beneath. Trenches zigzagged across the battlefield like jagged scars on the earth, filled with mud, water, and the faint, unshakable scent of decay. Shell craters formed small lakes, reflecting the gray sky above, broken occasionally by the distant flash of artillery fire. Private Edward Lawson huddled in his trench, gripping his rifle with trembling hands. At 19, he was far from the raw innocence of home, yet he had seen more death in the last 6 months than most men encountered in a lifetime. His uniform was soaked, mud caked to his boots, his face streaked with soot and exhaustion. Around him, the low murmur of soldiers' voices spoke of dread and anticipation. They all knew today might be the day they would not return. Across the barren no-man's land, the enemy trenches lay hidden beneath the thick morning mist. Edward could barely make out the dark shapes of German soldiers moving cautiously through the mud, the occasional glint of a bayonet catching the pale light. War had reduced everything to survival, distance, cover, and the calculation of when to act or when to hide. Edward's thoughts wandered to his younger brother, James, back in Yorkshire. The letters James had sent were full of mundane details, news of crops, the weather, and local gossip, but they had kept Edward tethered to a world that now seemed impossibly distant. He longed for the safety of home, for the warmth of his mother's kitchen, for the laughter that seemed impossible to remember amid the constant threat of artillery and gunfire. Suddenly, a faint movement in the mud across the trench caught Edward's eye. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but something about it made his stomach tighten. He raised his binoculars carefully, scanning the German line. A soldier, perhaps a boy like himself, was crouched low, writing something on a piece of paper. A flicker of hesitation passed through Edward's mind. Why would an enemy soldier take the risk to write in the middle of a battlefield? The whistle of incoming shells tore through the air, pulling Edward back to the present. The soldier ducked just in time as the earth erupted nearby, sending mud and debris flying. Edward felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, the sharp reminder that in war, curiosity could be as dangerous as bravery. Yet, even as he lowered his binoculars, a seed of intrigue had been planted, a question that would not let him go. Hours passed in a blur of tension. Patrols were sent to reconnoiter, artillery barges rumbled like distant thunder, and orders came down the line with mechanical precision. Edward's regiment was tasked with holding this section of the front, a narrow stretch of trench that had seen more assaults than any man wanted to count. Morale was fragile, kept alive only by camaraderie, routine, and the fleeting comfort of letters from home. As dusk approached, the battlefield transformed once again. The fog thickened, swallowing the craters and trenches in a suffocating gray. Visibility was almost zero, and the usual sounds of the battlefield, the cracking of rifles, the distant boom of shells, became muffled, ghostly echoes. It was in this surreal twilight that Edward saw the figure again, the enemy soldier crouched just beyond no man's land, carefully rolling a small piece of paper into a tube. Edward's heart pounded. He knew the risk, stepping outside the safety of the trench could mean instant death. But something about this act, so human and delicate amid the savagery, stirred a deep curiosity within him. He motioned to his closest comrade, Private Thomas Hayes, a grizzled veteran with eyes that had seen too much. "There's something out there," Edward whispered, voice barely audible over the wind. "A man, writing a letter, maybe." Thomas squinted into the fog, then shook his head. "Best leave him be. That's no man's land. You step out there, you won't make it back. You'll be lunch for snipers before he even knows you're there." Edward nodded, but the image of the soldier, so human, so deliberate, haunted him. The fog seemed to cling to his thoughts, blurring lines between enemy and friend, between survival and empathy. He could not stop thinking, Why risk writing when every second could be his last? Night fell slowly, wrapping the battlefield in an oppressive blackness. Edward tried to sleep, but the images of the solitary figure, hunched over his paper in the cold mud, refused to fade. The soldiers around him were quiet, some whispering prayers, others muttering letters to their loved ones, and Edward felt an unfamiliar pang of connection. Across trenches and barbed wire, across nationalities and orders, a simple act of writing had reminded him of shared humanity, a fragile, flickering light amid the darkness. Little did Edward know that this small, almost imperceptible act of courage would set in motion a chain of events that neither side could have anticipated. A single letter, written in secret across enemy lines, would bridge a gulf of fear, suspicion, and hatred, a reminder that even in war, the human heart could find ways to reach out, to understand, and to hope. And so, as the night deepened and the sounds of distant artillery softened to an uneasy lull, Edward held onto that image. Somewhere in the mud and fog, an enemy soldier had dared to write, to reach beyond the chaos, and Edward knew, in the core of his being, that tomorrow would bring a choice, a chance to see whether humanity could survive even here, on the bloodied, scarred earth of the Western Front. Crossing the lines. The morning of November 12 dawned cold and gray. The Western Front seemed suspended in an eerie silence, as if the battlefield itself held its breath, anticipating the violence that would inevitably erupt. The mud clung to everything, boots, uniforms, even the rifles, and each step was a calculated effort against exhaustion and treacherous footing. Private Edward Lawson emerged from his trench at first light, carrying a small satchel of rations and the habitual tension of a soldier who knew each day could be his last. Across no man's land, the fog still lingered, a pale gray curtain obscuring friend and foe alike. The distant rumble of artillery was less frequent now, but its presence lingered like a constant heartbeat, reminding every man that war did not pause, even for reflection. Edward's thoughts kept returning to the soldier he had seen the night before, crouched in the mud, writing, daring to find humanity amidst carnage. That simple act had unsettled him. War had trained him to see the enemy as an abstract target, a threat to survival, yet this soldier had written as if he, too, were tethered to a world beyond the trenches. By mid-morning, Edward received orders from his sergeant. Patrols would inspect the damaged barbed wire across the forward section, ensuring no enemy infiltrators had taken advantage of the fog. Edward volunteered to join, though the risk was palpable. The men moved cautiously, rifles at the ready, eyes scanning for movement, ears straining for sounds beyond the wind and distant artillery. It was during this patrol that Edward first discovered it, a small rolled-up piece of paper, wedged between two sandbags in the mud, almost invisible unless one looked closely. He froze, heart hammering. Could it be? His fingers trembled as he carefully unrolled the paper, wary of traps, wary of a soldier lying in wait. The letter was written in careful, precise handwriting, a stark contrast to the chaos surrounding it. It read, "To the soldier who finds this, I do not know your name, nor do I expect to. But know this, we are not so different. War has taken everything from me, yet I write to remind myself that there is still humanity in the world. Do not hate me. I am as afraid as you, as tired, as longing for home." Edward's breath caught. Every instinct screamed danger, yet every fiber of his being recognized the courage it took to write these words. Here, across the trenches, an enemy soldier had dared to reach out, to acknowledge shared suffering. He quickly rolled the letter back up and secured it in his pocket, heart racing. He knew he could not show it to the others. Any hint of sentiment could be misinterpreted as weakness, a dangerous liability in a place where death could arrive without warning. But he carried it with him, a secret reminder that humanity existed even in this hell. Over the next few days, Edward observed subtle signs across no man's land. Occasionally, a shovel would move slightly, revealing a buried note. A small bundle of food would appear in a mud-filled crater. The acts were subtle, almost imperceptible, yet consistent. Someone, an enemy soldier, was attempting to communicate, to find connection in a war that sought to erase individuality. Edward began to take risks. At first, small ones, leaving scraps of paper near the wire, arranging items in patterns that could signal his awareness without exposing him entirely. Each day, he tested the limits of trust, inching closer to the invisible line that separated survival from curiosity, instinct from conscience. The soldiers around him noticed his distraction. Private Thomas Hayes, ever skeptical, finally confronted him. "You're acting strange, Lawson." Eyes on the mud, always counting shapes, listening for whispers. "What is it?" Edward hesitated, knowing he could not fully explain. I think there's a soldier. Across the line. He's writing letters, leaving messages." Thomas laughed, a harsh, short sound that lacked humor. "Letters? You're telling me the Germans are pen pals now? Best keep your head down. Curiosity in no man's land gets you killed." Edward nodded, feigning compliance, but internally he resolved to continue. The letter had ignited something within him, a fragile hope that humanity could endure, even amidst death and devastation. He began to leave carefully folded notes of his own, small messages of understanding, hidden in mud and shell craters where only the intended recipient could find them. Over the next week, a silent exchange developed. Words of shared fear, longing for home, the pain of lost comrades, and fleeting hopes for peace were traded without sound, without visibility. Edward and his unseen counterpart began to construct a bridge over the blood-soaked land, a fragile lifeline of empathy stretching across no man's land. One afternoon, a shell struck perilously close to Edward while he was leaving another message. Mud splattered his uniform, and the shockwave sent him sprawling. But even as adrenaline surged and the battlefield threatened to reclaim his attention, he found himself smiling beneath the grime. The small act of connection had survived the violence. Somehow, against the odds, hope persisted. Yet, danger was never far. Rumors of a new enemy patrol circulated, moving cautiously across the forward areas. Edward's clandestine communication had to be more careful than ever. Every step, every movement was calculated. The letter exchanges had become a lifeline, but also a test of nerve, courage, and morality. Night after night, Edward returned to his trench with stories of home written on scraps of paper, exchanging fears for hopes, and hesitations for understanding. The unseen soldier responded with equal care, offering insights into life across the line, thoughts about family, and subtle observations about the futility of endless war. By the middle of the second week, Edward realized the exchange had transformed him. He was no longer just a soldier fighting to survive, he was a participant in a silent dialogue, one that transcended uniforms, nationality, and orders. Across a few hundred yards of mud and barbed wire, two young men had begun to reclaim their humanity, one letter at a time. Little did Edward know that the letters, fragile as they were, would soon carry a weight far greater than words alone. A choice loomed ahead, one that would test bravery in ways far beyond survival. When the day came, these silent messages would become a lifeline, a shield, and ultimately, a testament to the enduring power of empathy in the darkest of times. The meeting. The fog that had long shrouded no man's land was thinning, replaced by a cold, gray dawn that revealed the scarred terrain in all its brutal clarity. Craters from artillery punctuated the mud, and the twisted remnants of barbed wire stretched across the field like the skeletal fingers of some colossal hand. Each step forward was a negotiation with the earth itself. The ground had claimed the boots, the rifles, and sometimes the men who dared to cross it. Private Edward Lawson tightened the straps of his pack and gripped his rifle with a renewed sense of purpose. The letters had continued for over 2 weeks now, each note exchanged in silent, calculated peril. And yet, despite the constant threat of discovery, Edward felt a strange anticipation. The words, once a whisper of hope, had become a lifeline, a tether that connected him to another human being in the midst of unimaginable chaos. That morning, his sergeant ordered a routine inspection of the forward defenses, and Edward volunteered immediately. He had noticed subtle changes in the enemy's positions, shifts in sandbags, faint footprints in the mud, and something told him that his correspondent might be near. Every instinct screamed caution, yet curiosity propelled him forward. Reaching the outer trench, Edward paused, scanning the expanse before him. Across the field, barely discernible in the dim light, he saw a figure crouched low, moving with deliberate care. His heart thumped wildly. Could it be? The handwriting, the messages, the care with which each note had been placed, had it all led to this? The figure froze, as if sensing Edward's gaze. Then, slowly, cautiously, the man raised a hand in a tentative gesture of peace. Edward mirrored the movement, a silent acknowledgement that he understood. For a moment, the war, the mud, the guns, all of it, receded into the background. There were only two human beings, separated by nationality, uniforms, and ideology, yet united by something far more enduring, the recognition of shared humanity. They began to communicate with gestures, exchanging messages through folded pieces of paper, careful to remain hidden from the prying eyes of patrols and snipers. Each note was a fragile lifeline, a vessel carrying the weight of fears, memories, and hopes that could not be spoken aloud. Edward's correspondent, a German soldier named Friedrich, wrote of his hometown, of fields of wheat and the scent of fresh bread, of a sister who had once insisted he learn to play the piano. Each detail was a reminder that behind the uniform, behind the orders and the weapons, there existed a man who had dreams, fears, and attachments, just like Edward. Edward shared his own memories, the laughter of his younger brother, the warmth of his mother's kitchen, the first time he had ridden a bicycle down a country lane. Each confession was a risk, yet also a revelation. In that perilous exchange, the two soldiers reclaimed fragments of their lost innocence, building a bridge of empathy across the trench-filled divide. Over the next several days, the notes became more detailed, more personal. They began to discuss the war itself, not as a political abstraction, but as a shared experience of suffering. They spoke of comrades lost, of mud-caked uniforms, of nights spent in freezing trenches, and of the persistent gnawing fear that death could arrive with the next shell, the next sniper shot. The exchange did not go unnoticed forever. Patrols were active, and Edward had to learn to navigate both the physical dangers and the moral complexities of his actions. Every message carried the weight of potential exposure. One misstep could mean death for himself, for Friedrich, or for both. Then came the day that would change everything. The letters suggested a meeting, a brief, carefully timed encounter at a small crater midway between the lines. Edward prepared meticulously, choosing a route that minimized exposure and timing his approach to coincide with a natural lull in enemy patrols. The meeting was brief, tense, and surreal. They were finally face to face, two men who had shared words across the no-man's land for weeks, now standing within a few meters of each other, their breaths visible in the cold morning air. Edward extended a hand, Friedrich hesitated, then accepted it with a firmness that belied the danger surrounding them. They spoke in hushed tones, careful to remain inaudible to anyone nearby. For the first time, they discussed strategy, not as adversaries, but as men who recognized the futility of indiscriminate violence. They shared observations about the battlefield, noting patterns in patrol movements, artillery fire, and supply lines. Each insight was delivered cautiously, each word a calculated risk, but also a testament to the trust that had grown between them. This brief encounter solidified what the letters had begun, a recognition that, even in war, humanity could survive. Edward and Friedrich returned to their respective lines with a newfound awareness. They were still enemies in the eyes of their superiors, yet the invisible bond forged through words and gestures persisted, unbroken by orders or ideology. The rest of November passed in a tense equilibrium. The letters continued, now with added urgency. Both men realized that this fragile connection was precarious, vulnerable to the ever-present dangers of the battlefield. They began to document the stories of fallen comrades, of small acts of bravery, of fleeting moments of kindness that had punctuated the endless violence. These letters became archives of memory, humanizing a war that often reduced men to numbers. Edward reflected often on the transformation within himself. The fear, fatigue, and trauma that had once consumed him were now tempered by the awareness that empathy could persist even across trenches, even between enemies. The experience reshaped his understanding of courage, not the courage to kill, but the courage to acknowledge shared suffering, to act with moral clarity when all around demanded brutality. Yet, as December approached, the danger intensified. Enemy reinforcements, increased artillery, and unpredictable patrols threatened the fragile equilibrium. Each letter, each secret gesture, carried the weight of life and death. Edward understood that the next encounter could be the last, and the decisions made in these moments would define not only his survival but also the legacy of the bridge of humanity they had built. Across the divide. The cold of December had settled over the battlefield, seeping into trenches, craters, and hearts alike. Frost clung to every surface, crystallizing on the edges of sandbags and rifles, and transforming no man's land into a brittle, white expanse. Yet beneath this frozen exterior, tension simmered like a coiled spring, for both sides understood that winter did not halt war. Private Edward Lawson moved cautiously along the trench line, each step calculated, each sound measured against the eerie silence that hung over the field. The letters had stopped coming for a few days, and a quiet unease had settled in his chest. He feared that Friedrich, his correspondent and unlikely confidant, might have been discovered, or worse. The thought twisted his gut, a reminder that every human connection in war carried both risk and reward. Then, as the sun began to rise over the shattered landscape, a small, folded piece of paper appeared at the edge of the trench, wedged carefully between stones and mud. Edward froze, heart racing. The handwriting was unmistakable. Friedrich. His hands trembled as he retrieved the note, brushing frost from its corners. The letter spoke of survival, of the daily struggle against hunger, cold, and the ever-present threat of artillery. It also conveyed a request, a final, audacious meeting. The text was precise, offering a location equidistant from both lines, a moment of silence in the chaos, a chance to speak beyond ink and paper. Edward felt a surge of resolve. He knew the risks, yet he also understood that some connections were too vital to abandon. Night fell, and Edward prepared for the encounter. The trench walls were slick with frozen mud, the wind carrying the faint moans of distant artillery fire. Every sense was heightened, the rustle of rats, the crack of splintering wood, the whistle of wind through the craters, all conspiring to warn him of the dangers ahead. He moved carefully, sticking to shallow depressions and ruined foxholes, counting his breaths, timing each step to avoid detection. Across no man's land, Friedrich mirrored the same precautions. Their world, usually separated by uniform and ideology, was now defined by instinct, trust, and the fragile thread of human empathy. Each step was a test, a negotiation with fate itself. When they finally met, the sight was surreal. Two men, once separated by barbed wire, shellfire, and unyielding orders, now stood within arm's reach. The dim light revealed fatigue etched deeply into their faces, yet there was a glimmer of relief, a shared understanding that transcended their roles as soldiers. They exchanged no words initially, only gestures, a nod, a tentative hand extended, a glance that conveyed recognition. Then the letters were unfolded and shared between them, each note recounting small victories, fleeting moments of compassion, the stories of those who had fallen unnoticed, and the hope that some humanity could survive even here. Edward spoke first, his voice low but steady. All of this, it could be gone in an instant. Friedrich nodded, the weight of agreement pressing down on them both. Yes, he replied in careful English, but we choose what survives. Even if only these words, these small truths. They talked for hours, moving through memories and reflections. Friedrich recounted acts of mercy he had witnessed, men giving their rations to the weak, sharing warmth beneath tattered blankets, tending to wounds no officer would sanction. Edward shared stories of camaraderie in the trenches, of letters from home that brought fleeting comfort, of laughter stolen in moments when survival seemed impossible. As dawn approached, they understood the fragile reality of their connection. Orders would not forgive empathy. Commanders demanded obedience, and the machinery of war tolerated no bridges across enemy lines. Yet in the quiet, frost-covered no man's land, they had created something impossible, a space where humanity could persist. Before departing, Edward handed Friedrich a folded notebook, bound in worn leather. It contained a complete collection of their letters, observations, and reflections. "If we don't survive," he began, voice catching, "then at least this remains." Friedrich accepted it, eyes glistening with unspoken gratitude. "It will. And someday, perhaps someone will understand." They parted with a handshake, firm and deliberate, a silent promise that their secret would endure beyond the battlefield. Each returned to their respective lines, hearts heavy with the weight of what had been shared and the knowledge of the dangers that still loomed. Weeks passed. Artillery bombardments continued, patrols swept the trenches, and the war raged on. Edward often found himself glancing toward no man's land, imagining Friedrich moving silently among the ruins. He carried the notebook close, reading its contents whenever fear or exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him. The letters, once mere scraps of paper, had become a testament to resilience, morality, and the enduring human spirit. They documented not only the horrors of war but also the capacity for compassion, understanding, and courage amidst chaos. In the months that followed, both men survived multiple engagements, always mindful of the precarious connection that had transformed their experience. Though separated physically, they were bound by a shared commitment to preserve humanity even in a world designed to strip it away. Years later, long after the guns had fallen silent, Edward would look back on that December in the trenches and remember a lesson that endured far beyond the battlefield. He would remember that amidst death, despair, and destruction, the smallest acts of empathy, the exchange of a letter, a gesture of trust, a moment of recognition, could define not only survival but legacy. The letters, carefully preserved, would eventually be published, revealing to the world a story that history books often overlooked, that even in the darkest hours of war, humanity could be found across the trenches, in the most unlikely places, and between the most improbable of friends. And so, the story of Edward Lawson and Friedrich remains as a testament, not to strategy or victories, but to the enduring truth that even enemies can recognize each other as human beings. Across trenches, across language, across uniform, the letters endured, a bridge of trust, a symbol of hope, and a reminder that compassion can persist even in hell.